The Normans in Normandy. The region that became Normandy was not a new creation of the Normans. It was approximately the same as the old church province of Rouen, and lacking natural frontiers, was little more than an administrative unit agreed upon by the Norman Duke and the French King. Its population had been essentially Gallo-Roman, with a small Frankish Germanic addition. A substantial number of Scandinavians, Vikings, had settled, but they were divided between small colonies in upper eastern Normandy and larger colonies in lower western Normandy. Scandinavian colonization began at the end of the ninth century, but in 911, Rollo, a leader of the Seine Valley settlers, forced Charles III of France to recognize his occupation of part of Upper Normandy, probably in return for his accepting Christianity and giving military aid to the French monarch. This, of course, didn't mean that he all of a sudden knew what pagan traditions differed from Christian traditions. They didn't know what the differences were at first, because the missionaries showed up and like told them stuff like Jesus is hanging out with Odin and Thor. They sold him as just another Roman god, like it had been forever. So, yeah. It wasn't clear at first how they were expected to be different, and so the church absorbed a whole lot of paganism from the people it converted. Like they just didn't stop doing their old customs. Some of people in Europe still leave bowls of rice pudding up for the tomte. You know, the more things change, the more they stay the same. This Treaty of Saint Clair sur Epte is shrouded in legend, but it is clear that by 923, Rollo had won control over the other Scandinavian settlers in Lower Normandy. His successors pushed back the frontier with Brittany and made Rouen into a flourishing mercantile city, in close contact with Scandinavia and the Viking ruled parts of northern England, the Danelaw. Thereafter, until William the Bastard's crushing victory at Val es Dunes in 1047, Norman history centered upon the struggle of successive dukes to unite Normandy and dominate its warlike aristocracy. Until the early 11th century, the Normans were still Viking in character, welcoming Scandinavian raiding fleets as allies. On the other hand, one important Viking institution, the Democratic Assembly, or Thing, was never seen among the Normans. Early Normandy was also militarily weak compared to its neighbors, Norman forces being smaller than those of Anjou, as well as having inferior discipline. Somehow I doubt that. Although crudely executed, weathered by the centuries, and photographed in shadow, these two carvings of Anglo Norman warriors, circa 1180, from the south door of St. Mary Barfastron, Bar- Barfaston Church in Kent, can still be seen to show the horseman with his lance in the couched position, and the knight on foot with a conical nasal helm, a split hauberk, and a kite shield with the top edge cut off straight. Feudalism. As the feudalization of Normandy progressed, so Norman strength grew. Feudalism has often been described in misleadingly simplified terms. Essentially, however, it was a means of unifying a state by binding together ruler and ruled, king with duke, local lord with humble knight, knigget, through solemn oaths of vassalage, fealty, or homage. This was considered an honorable arrangement, and it formed a contract under which the strong agreed to defend the weak to support the strong. So, it's like we go start a business and you gonna be security and I'm gonna grow the grain and then he's gonna grind it up and she's gonna bake it into bread. The more favored a vassal, the more likely he was to be awarded a piece of land or fief, plus its inhabitants. This he held as the tenant of his lord. Such an estate was to help a vassal, usually a knight, to afford the increasingly expensive military equipment of the day. This was the archetypal fief de hauberk, the hauberk being a mail shirt, which supposedly distinguished an elite armored cavalryman from the rest of the army. The fief also freed the warrior from manual work so that he could concentrate on his military skills. Because, yeah, specialization. So, you know, young man might get pretty strong chopping the field, but as he gets older, he needs to go practice, chopping with the sword. Everything takes practice. That's how you do magic. The Death of Absalom in a painted Bible, probably made in Winchester, Hampshire, circa 1150-75. Note the clearly painted details: the high saddle with twin girths, the hauberks with mittens and ventails for hoifs, the round-topped helmet, left, with a nasal and with painted motifs. The so-called Phrygian cap version of the nasal helmet, center, with its forward-tilting shape perhaps indicating extra thickness of metal at the front. And the kite shield, painted in chevrons. Several other scenes from the life of David on this same page all show knights in either round-topped or Persian cap-shaped helmets. Other shield patterns include diagonal bends and two-color checkers set diamond fashion on the shield. Pierpont Morgan Library, manuscript 619, Verso, New York. So, yeah. Over here, the man with the helmet also has the shield and chevrons. We'll look up this and probably post a colored copy of this image. Tristan fights Morholt, a painted marriage chest, probably Breton of 1150-70, Cathedral Treasury, Venice. We'll look up that one too. Post links to the museum website. So the fief also freed the warrior from manual work so that he could concentrate on his military skills. Medieval terminology is notoriously imprecise, but it does seem that the milites were true vassals, though not necessarily holding land. Okay. Medieval terminology is notoriously imprecise, but it does seem that the Milites were true vassals, though not necessarily holding land, while the stipendari, yeah, probably, the stipendari swore lesser oaths and fought primarily for pay. Each could, however, be regarded as an early form of knight. Comparable bonds linked the peasants with the infighting vassal, but were decreasingly honorable, which in turn reflected the declining military status of the general peasant levy. Not that foot soldiers as such were disappearing from the scene. In fact, infantry seemed to have grown more specialized and were no longer simply drawn from an untrained peasantry. Deep rooted as Norman feudalism was by the 11th century, it was never as neat as the system imposed by England after 1066. One Norman peculiarity was the vavasseur, an unclear military status and form of land tenure between knight and peasant, which was probably a leftover from pre-feudal times. And that's tribal, so just you know, the Gauls versus the Romans. Then the Romans versus the Britons and the Anglo-Saxons show up 500 years later. This all goes on. This directly affected my ancestors. As an American, you think back, 1776, and before that, public history education is rather lacking. But we know, we know our history. We know about Le Grand Dérangement. We know about how the young French king comes into power at 16, and he asks the Jesuit bishop what he should do, and the Jesuit bishop says, "Kick out them people." Yep. Just before 1700. Duke, lords, and church. In many parts of Europe, the growing effectiveness of the military class led to private war and near anarchy. But in Normandy, it was accompanied by a growth in the power of the Duke. This was not a smooth process, as ducal authority, particularly over castle building, suffered a setback in the 1030s and 1040s. A breakthrough came in the reign of Duke William, later William the Conqueror, before his invasion of England in 1066. At first, William cooperated with his military aristocracy. Then, in 1047, he crushed those who still defied him in the decisive battle of Val-es-Dunes. During the following years, the Duke's government was aggressive, warlike, and much to the taste of his knights and nobles. Puppy dogs, get down. No, down, down, puppy. Need a stump up here. He was, in fact, a fine general, calm but decisive, and well able to win the respect of ordinary servants. William's exceptional organizational ability was well illustrated in his gathering of an army and a fleet in 1066. Because that's what mattered. That is definitely what mattered the most. You know, like I'm so wealthy and famous and powerful. I can do this. I can claim that the king, the crown of England belongs to me, and I should be king. William's exceptional organizational ability was well illustrated in his gathering of an army and a fleet in 1066. The Duke's own large estates, domain, enabled him to enfeoff and enrich loyal supporters, who were then placed in command of key castles and forces. Duke William did not, however, have such control over castle building, and so had to take a more persuasive cooperative line with his barons. Yet he did win the right to enter any castle, so stopping local lords from falsely seizing additional fortifications in his name. Neither were economic measures ignored, the development of William's favorite city of Caen being encouraged in an effort to strengthen ducal authority in Lower Normandy. Or that would just make the greatest D&D setting. Powerful as William might have grown by 1066, the Duke still had to consult his barons and win their sometimes grudging support for his great invasion of England. Diplomatic preparations were also vital. Duke William remained a vassal of France, virtually independent though he now seemed. Yet he convinced most European rulers of his right to the English crown, and above all he won papal support, symbolized by a banner which was flown at Hastings. It makes such a great game. You could go around to all of the NPCs or even other players out in the fields doing pagan things. They did still pray to Diana back then. They didn't see it as separate yet. The church didn't do all that crazy shit at that time yet. They hadn't. The church hadn't gone crazy yet. But it's all in the astrology. It all shows everything you want to know about what happened and what will happen is in the astrology. The warlike aristocracy which Duke William came to dominate was a new class of new men compared to the old aristocracy of France. I'm gonna have to look into that some more. I want some details on that. These latter often claimed descent from Carolingian times, but few Norman families could trace their ancestry back before 1010. Well, we know that Vikings were, young men of pretty big families who their older brother was obviously going to inherit, so they had to go off and find something else to do. And we know that this has been going on since the Stone Age and the Corios. So they went down to France and started new families and new farms, however they had to. Ever they had. The military class had also bred with remarkable speed. Most communicants remained poor and land hungry. Land hunger being simply a matter of survival, and by 1066, Normandy had been exporting warriors for more than a generation. Poor and land hungry. Does that mean they had land and wanted more, or they didn't have land? At first, when I read it, it sounded like land hungry meant they were looking for land because they didn't have any, but maybe that means expansion. Land hunger being simply a matter of survival. Well, yeah, it's like you need a piece of land to survive on. You really do. So, I got so many clovers. Just need some goats, man. Bring me some goats and sheep. I can graze on my clovers. Bring me some bees. I got so many clovers and blackberry flowers. I need some bees, man. I can make some honey. That's what I need to do. I need some honey. Definitely. Definitely need me some bees. I've seen some floating around here. I need to put a nice big old upside down bell shaped pot out here. Little hole in it for the bees to come in and out. Make it out of clay. Blaze it and fire it in the little open furnace over there. Make it in two halves. See some of those pottery makers do that. Squirrel. Oh, it's a puppy. I could make a like a big pot, but it's like in two halves that nest together. Get it out here and just let the bees find it. There are ways of enticing the bees to find it, right? So, land hunger. So, English brown, table support, batter for the Hastings, Indian, 1010, beef, preparation. There's the land hunger. Land hunger is right here. So, most knights remained poor and land hunger being simply a matter of survival, and by 1066 Normandy had been exporting warriors for more than a generation. The alliance between Duke William and the papacy reflected a long-standing cooperation between the Norman leadership and the church. The church helped unify Normandy. Many ecclesiastical leaders came from the Norman aristocracy, while others were retired warriors. The secular aristocracy enthusiastically founded monasteries, many of which then owed military service for their lands, as you do. This was clearly what they considered business back then. It was like a monastery was a lot of things. They grew things there, they kept books there, they wrote books. It was sort of the beginnings of factories. Sort. Carolus Linnaeus, grew all of his beans and then learned about taxonomy and plant classification and genetics, basically. The principle of genetics was found by Carolus Linnaeus in a monastery. It's like the early version. I said, it's also like a college campus, basically. So men go away to study. Get their heads full of stuff that isn't so. They know so much that isn't so. Like it's the early form of both because cottage industry was how things were done back then. Every household made their cheese, made their pots. I mean, even if you look at stuff from the Stone Age, you cook at Tinitripilia. That one's hard to say. Cook at Tinitripilia. Okay, so you look that up, and Dan Davis did a great video on it where he showed that, every other household was making their own pots. And yeah, they had a style, and archaeologists talk about it in abstract terms, like, oh, this culture had this style. It really comes down to the individual artists and their traditions and their family heritage. 'Cause, you grow up making pots the way your father made pots or your mother made pots. You know, it was probably the women messing with the clay, because men had other things to do. Sitting inside playing with clay is very much, and then like we know the women tended the fires because to this day women are cold and men are hot and can't be in the same room comfortably for many reasons. So it seems to me that men spent their time outside doing things and women inside firing the kiln up and making pottery and all the other things, weaving and whatnot. So up until this point, that was still basically how things were done. Every farmstead in town had their cottage industries. And I really think that this is going to return how things are. From how things are now with, warehouses full of manufacturing equipment. It all got shut, not all of it, but a lot of it got shut down in America. So I think it's going to return to the homes. Like people are going to rent vacant warehouses instead of t-shirt printing shops like the fine people at Teespring in Kentucky. Those are made in America. And so that's how it's gonna be, I think, going forward. Is we're just gonna reset up cottage industry. There's already tons and tons of homestead prepper type channels where normal Americans are buying farms and making honey and butter and that how to make everything fella is recreating the progress of civilization in his shed. Man's a genius. And then of course there was Grant, the king of random. The church helped unify Normandy. Many ecclesiastical leaders came from the Norman aristocracy, while others were retired warriors. The secular aristocracy enthusiastically founded monasteries, many of which then owed military service for their lands. In fact, it seemed as if many of the earliest landed knights were linked to such abbeys, particularly those near exposed frontiers. Basically, paladins. The paladins lived at the monastery. They could have a place to sleep. Their smart friend to tell them what's what. They place to pray, a little chapel, on the monastery grounds, to pray and stuff. Well, that's how you just did back then. They were paladins. Not that there was yet any great social distinction between landed and landless knights. Knighthood itself held little status, and merely indicated that a man was a professional warrior. He often appeared as a mere statistic, as in a pre-1066 charter of the Abbey of Saint Pierre de Chartres, which described one village as having a church, land for 3 plough teams, 12 peasants, 5 free knights, and a mill. Nor did knighthood yet involve much pomp or display. Rather, it consisted of hard training and harder knocks. Yeah, basically, they were starting what one would think nowadays of a business. Buy some land, get you some peasants, hire some manual labor to plow the fields and make the beans so that Carlos Linnaeus and there could study them. Tactics. Cavalry training was undertaken in groups of 5 to 10. Standards of discipline were clearly higher than most critics of medieval warfare have allowed. And the same was probably true of command and control at this basic unit level. It might also be fair to say that medieval generalship was as good or as inadequate as in any other age. The basic fighting unit was the conroi of 20 to 30 men in 2 or 3 ranks. This would have been identified by its own small spear-mounted flag or bonfanion. While shield devices were probably only decorative at this time, flags were essential for command and control. Okay, I disagree that what's on your shield is purely decorative. It has always been directly linked to who and what you are. Family coat of arms weren't like quite defined at this point yet, but it had always been really a thing. You put the symbols of your family and your culture on your arms and armor. You put what was yours, to designate your things. You didn't identify with the artwork or symbols of others. Your family traditions was what you held up. What my family still understands, what the Cajun people still understand, is that when my grandma makes her artwork, she is painting things that matter to her and to us as a people. It's not just command and control. Flags represent who you are. And yeah, they can be used for signaling and telling you what to do. They're very important. Don't ever let the leftists tell you otherwise. They held their flags as sacred because that's what flags are. While shield devices were probably only decorative at this time, probably not. Flags were essential for command and control. Yeah. The evidence suggests that the Norman conroi, or larger bataille, to which it contributed, was well able to make controlled charges, to wheel, to turn, and even to retreat in feigned flight, a difficult maneuver demanding discipline and adequate signaling procedures. The whole question of the feigned retreat by 11th century Norman cavalry is still hotly debated. It seems to have been employed against the French at St. Aubin in 1053 and against the Sicilian Arabs at Messina in 1060. The Normans might have learned it from their Breton neighbors, or from men returning from service in southern Italy or Spain. Breton cavalry seem to have known of the feigned retreat even in the 10th century, and it is worth noting that the Breton left wing at Hastings was the first part of Duke William's army apparently to retreat. I don't think they would have had to learn it from foreigners. I think everybody gets the concept of faking like you're retreating so that you draw the enemy in and trap them. I don't think they would have had to necessarily learn it from anybody else than their own experience on the battlefield. Hick for real. Yeah, all these different armies were always fighting each other. I'm sure pretending like you're backing up has always been a tactic. Probably a desperate one. Because, if you're strong and you got your shield wall together, then you push forward. But I'm sure they must have noticed at some point that if you do retreat and the enemy follows you, you might use the terrain to your advantage and trap them. And so the feigned retreat became a thing, naturally. This thing about having to learn it from foreigners, though. Sword hilts of the Norman era. A. Italian, 11th century, location unknown. B. Probably continental European, 11th to 12th century, Bunratty Castle, County Clare, Ireland. C. Probably English, 13th century, Wallace Collection, London. D. French, blade inscribed Gicelin Mefecit, Gislin made me, circa 1130 to 70. Private collection. No, the battery's not low. The screen is dark. Hey. Hi. Hold on. Uh-oh, don't spill it. Where was it? Gislin made me. Circle. Private collection. Okay. E. Hilt and scabbard of the ceremonial imperial sword of the Holy Roman Empire. Probably made Sicily circa 1220. Kunst Museum, Vienna. That's that real fancy one right here. E.
Oh, no. No. Bad.
F. French, circa 1150 to 75. Collection P-R. Royer Paris. G. Enameled pommel of sword of Peter of Dreux, probably captured at Mansoura, 1250. Subsequently purchased in Damascus, Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York. H. Pommel of Syrian, manufactured for a European owner, 13th century, Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York.